fugitive slave law, right? So I'm going to record this again and post this later. I don't expect a response today. You've got a homework assignment due tomorrow, but I'll post this with my lecture notes on Thursday and the recording from Thursday, and I will expect a response to that. And you do have an outline due on Friday, so Thursday could be a little bit of a busy night, but I'll give you some time to respond. You won't have to respond Thursday night if you don't want to. Okay? All right, now remember the conditions of this new stricter fugitive slave law as part of the Compromise of 1850. Now, the original fugitive slave law had been passed way back in 1793 with the original Constitution, but Southern slaveholders and those invested in slavery felt like it wasn't being enforced very well. So they wanted this, they had this stricter one as part of the Compromise of 1850. Once again, I already presented this to you, but I guess I'll repeat it. All runaway slaves had to be returned to their owners. It became illegal to aid them. You yourself, if you did aid slaves, right, and not help them their return, could be fined or imprisoned. And I had some questions about that. This will affect thousands of people. But it will be difficult to enforce. When he asked about enforcement, and it will be difficult to enforce, jailing everyone who resists and refuses to help, because there'll be strong resistance to this law, as you're reading about. Okay. The thing that was unfair about it was the fact that judges or magistrates who decided on these trials of an accused runaway slave is that if they got paid $10 as opposed to $5 if they sided with the slave owner, and the accused runaway slave was forced to return. And that's an unfair provision, I would argue, right? That could maybe bias you if you get more money deciding one way or the other as a judge. Now, one of the reasons for a stricter fugitive slave law is Southerners were complaining about the Underground Railroad, right? And they had complained that they had lost thousands of slaves as a result of this. And I did a little bit of digging on this to get to the right page here. And according to some sources I read, but it stated it's impossible to estimate numbers that escaped, but the South did lose approximately 100,000 slaves between 1810 and 1850. And that was actually according to the PBS Underground Railroad website. Okay, so that's a lot when you're talking $1,800 a pop, right? Okay, if you're just valuing people's property, that's a heck of an investment loss, right? 100,000 people, 100,000 pieces of property, right? Now, some sites say 1,000 a year. There are some historians who sometimes say the success of the Underground Railroad is exaggerated, and that they say it's exaggerated because it's a way for people to feel better about slavery, right? Well, there was the Underground Railroad and we did all this. So some historians say that sometimes the figures are exaggerated. So the numbers are debated, as it seems like almost everything is in history. I do love this map once again, although maybe this isn't the exact one I showed you before, but I do love that it demonstrates the importance of Ohio to the Underground Railroad. And I mentioned the Underground Railroad Museum down here on the Ohio River in Cincinnati. It's a great place to go visit if you're into visiting museums like I am. I'm a history geek. It's a very nice one. Okay, look, we even got Sandusky, Ohio up here, right in Lake Erie, and the importance of getting into importance of getting into Canada. Okay, now here's what I want to tell you. With, we talk about resistance, and you're reading about that with your current assignment, right? At least a particular instance of it with Anthony Burns. But resistance to the fugitive slave law will not, even though it's stricter, it doesn't die down. Traffic on the Underground Railroad remains frequent after 1850. Okay, Harriet Tubman remains active after 1850. So the success of this stricter fugitive slave law and slowing down the Underground Railroad is not very much, okay, if at all. Okay, now I mentioned that this was a particularly divisive part of the Compromise of 1850. Okay, it infuriated opponents of slavery. Okay, drew more to the cause. Okay. More moderates became anti-slavery. There were protests, there were riots, there was outright defiance. Once again, you're reading about one of those. This will occur throughout the North. And I mentioned to you earlier, and there's some evidence to this, that abolitionists Dr. Blight talks about this, that abolitionists will actually use states' rights to argue for resistance to this act. That the Confederates weren't the first to bring up the issue of states' rights in American history. I did hyperlink the Anthony Burns case on this slide, but I don't know that I need to show that to you because you're currently investigating it. And I think the other thing to point out about this is it showed slavery was a national problem, not regional, right? That this was an issue that was engulfing much of the country. It wasn't just a Southern issue, or maybe even just a Western issue with the issue of expansion. This was indeed a national issue. And think about some of the reactions to Garrison and other abolitionists that occurred in the North. But it's interesting how the fugitive slave law kind of switches that, right? And now you're seeing abolitionism becoming more popular. The arguments of a William Lloyd Garrison more popular, right? The arguments of Frederick Douglass more popular. It's affecting more people's lives now, right? Okay. So kind of, I think those who argued for the Compromise of 1850 underestimated the impact of the stricter fugitive slave law. Now, I mentioned the issue of expansion. Let's return to the issue of expansion, shall we? And that brings up the issue of Kansas and Nebraska. Now, notice an issue with expansion here that perhaps I haven't mentioned very much, or you haven't read about much at this point, the issue of a railroad, right? Northerners are supporting in the 1850s a railroad out west, but much of the region is unorganized. This map's maybe a little bit smaller than it should be. It's not taking up a full slide here. You've got this large swath of still unorganized territory here, right? And that's a dangerous place to think about putting in a transcontinental railroad, right? There are still Native Americans out there and possible Native American attacks and things like that that can occur. But many politicians and many people in the country, including many people in the North, are starting to recognize the economic benefit, right, of perhaps connecting, right, the eastern part of the country, the Midwestern part of the country, with those new territories out west. A railroad traveling across the country is starting to make a lot of sense, right? Now, Southerners would like to expand slavery west. We've talked about that. They want to make sure that their market continues to expand. Those who want to contain slavery, and Abraham Lincoln, who believes in containing slavery, their argument, sometimes I compare it to containment of communism, right? The theory with containment of communism was if you contain communism, it'll eventually die out. At least the Soviet Union will. That's kind of what those who want to contain slavery are arguing. That, we can't end it right now. Lincoln was never an immediate abolitionist. Well, never is a strong word. I think maybe he eventually became an immediate abolitionist. But through most of his career, he's never an immediate abolitionist. But he believes that if you contain slavery, that eventually it'll die out because it'll be less profitable. The market will get saturated, right? Southerners know that in order to maintain the profitability of slavery, maybe even to maintain the profitability of cotton, they need to acquire land, okay? So that's why there's this argument for expanding slavery west. Now, why do I bring that up with the Transcontinental Railroad? It's because there's a little old-fashioned free market capitalism going on here, at least regionally, right? The North and the South are competing with, hey, who's going to build that Transcontinental Railroad first, right? Some good old-fashioned, business enterprise competition, right? Free market capitalism, okay? Now, Missouri Compromise, remember that was passed way back in 1820, and I might have misspoke a little bit in my last lecture when I said the Compromise of 1850 essentially repealed the Missouri Compromise, although maybe you could kind of make that argument because these two territories, right, it's kind of undetermined yet where slavery is going to be, and the Utah territory is above 3630, and people are arguing for popular sovereignty there. But there are still people kind of holding on to the notion that slavery shouldn't be up here, and that hopefully Utah will be the states that are carved out of the Utah territory will be free. So perhaps the Missouri Compromise hasn't been completely done away with yet, but it's about to be. Enter Stephen Douglas again. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Kansas and Nebraska. You may remember Stephen Douglas was kind of essential, maybe more behind the scenes with the Compromise of 1850. Other congressmen I mentioned with that were Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. Okay. But Stephen Douglas is one of the rising stars, right? Maybe the rising star in Congress. As a matter of fact, there's really no secret. This guy could definitely be president someday, and he has that ambition. And what better way to secure your popularity, right? And to secure some votes than to be the guy who brought a transcontinental railroad to the United States, right? Now, he's a senator from Illinois, right? So he would like that transcontinental railroad to come from Illinois and go across out to California, right? Okay. So this is a northern, this would be the northern transcontinental railroad. Eventually there'll be 3 of them anyway. Okay. So he's hoping to beat the South, right? In building the first transcontinental railroad. He wants to connect Chicago to California and Oregon. Okay. This would greatly benefit Chicago economically. And indeed it does. Eventually Chicago becomes the meatpacking plant of the world, right? Because all those ranchers out west are going to be shipping their cows and whatever other products right into Chicago to be turned into food, right? Maybe you heard of the Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which documents some of that activity of the early 1900s, right? Okay, and this is great. This is an ambitious project for Douglas. He wants to be president someday, okay? And there are those who think he perhaps should be, okay? So he helps negotiate a new act. So another leadership, taking leadership in Congress. And we see the passage of the Kansas and Nebraska Act in 1854. And this is going to organize 2 new territories north of Texas and that unorganized territory I showed you on that map. And that's going to be Kansas and Nebraska. Okay. This will officially, if there was anything left of the Missouri Compromise in 1854, there is no longer anything left to it. Because what's happening now is slavery in Kansas and Nebraska will be determined by popular sovereignty. Okay. And once again, popular sovereignty, really it sounds logical. Let the people of the territory vote, but there are those who say that slavery is immoral and should be outlawed federally. And there's going to be some corruption and some, let's just say that the way in which popular sovereignty will be carried out is going to show the problems of it, which we will get to when we talk about bleeding Kansas, which Josh, I know you already know a lot about, probably more than me at this point. Okay. Remember, popular sovereignty had always kind of been Douglas's baby. He was promoted it in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, and he's going to continue to promote it. Just dramatically pausing here because the slide has a decent amount on it. Let me take another sip of coffee here. Eating more coffee today after staying up late last night. All right. So here's a map kind of reflecting what the Kansas-Nebraska Act brought about. You can see once again the Utah and the New Mexico Territory here, Texas, Oklahoma, interesting, hasn't been formed yet. That's still labeled as Indian Territory. But you see the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory being carved out of that unorganized territory. If it gets organized, right, now Douglas can maybe get his railroad, right, from Chicago, which is about up here, right, on that lake right there, right, boom, out west, right. And who knows how many states can be carved out of those territories, right? Look at all those big territories: New Mexico, Utah, Nebraska, Kansas, Washington Territory, Minnesota Territory. Those can be more than one state, right? And indeed they will be, as I'm sure you know. So how many states can be carved out of here? Now, what Douglas is acting as is he's acting as a champion of Western expansion and popular sovereignty. But what he underestimated is the opposition to slavery. And so what are abolitionists freeing here? Or what are free soilers freeing here? Now remember, free soilers may not necessarily be abolitionists, but they don't want slavery coming into these territories because they think labor in the United States should be defined by a man getting paid for his labor. The free labor ideology, that's what I control. I control my work ethic, I control my skills, I should get paid for those. That should be part of the American dream. Pretty good argument, I would argue, getting paid for your wages, right? Okay. So free soilers are concerned about popular sovereignty allowing the slave power to spread into the Northwest north of 3630, right? And therefore the slave power interests. I mean, could you imagine if, you know, the slave power interests gained control of all of this territory? Now that's unlikely, but nevertheless, free soilers fear that, right? And if they gain control of all that, if you had multiple states upsetting this balance that we see so far established, which I forgot to mention the other day, kids, when California was made a state with the Compromise of 1850, Maine was too, right? So you're balancing out some of these, or actually Maine was made a state when Missouri was made a state. So all along they've been balancing things out, but now popular sovereignty has a possibility of upsetting that balance, okay? So let's look at the impact. This again infuriated the opponents of slavery. Once again, Douglas probably was upset with, or I'm sorry, underestimated the opponents of slavery, those who might be upset with popular sovereignty and the possibility, just the fact that popular sovereignty is leaving open the possibility of slavery spreading to these territories is what's upsetting abolitionists and free soilers, okay? And this will actually lead to the death of the Whig Party and the Second American Party system. And I want to close out my presentation today talking a little bit about that. You've heard me mention the Whigs a couple times, something that I need, right? The Whig, right? The Whigs were part of our first American party system, remember, were Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists became the Democratic Republicans. They eventually dropped the Republican and just became Democrats, right? The Democratic Party was really kind of infirmed, is that the right word to use that? Or firmly placed into the American political system with Andrew Jackson, right? The Whigs are going to be the opponents of the Democrats. They'll be the opponents of Andrew Jackson, okay? So I've got a few little notes, well, maybe not a few here. There's actually a decent amount of notes in this slide. So here's a little bit about the Second American Party system, okay? And I'm actually closing my presentation with this today. One more slide after this, okay? So what we see here is the Second American Party system is the two dominant political parties since the 1820s are going to be the Democrats, who are supporters of Andrew Jackson, perhaps more supporters of the things that Andrew Jackson supported, such as, Andrew Jackson actually supported slavery, but he also supported the Union, right? And that's also going to be a big part of Andrew Jackson. They're going to be anti-tariff, right? Okay, so those are going to be some of the things that they support. The Whigs will be opponents of Jackson. Two of their key issues are internal improvements, and the Whigs tended to be anti-expansionists. Now, by the way, they got their name. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a Whig party back in colonial times in England, and that party will continue to exist through the War of 1812 even, which I know we had to skip over. But the Whigs were a revolutionary party, a very democratic party in England, in that they supported just letting the colonies go. Just let them go, King, right? If they want to govern themselves, let them govern themselves, or give them representation in Parliament. So the Whigs are modeling themselves after that English version of the Whig Party. That's where they got their name from, okay? Their key issues are internal improvements. They support the creation of canals, for example, railroads, right? Bridges and roads. And they believe that the federal government can do that through the management of interstate commerce. States' rights people, which are more lean towards more the Democrats, they don't like that. They believe that the states should be in charge of those things, perhaps not realizing that the federal government can provide a lot more funding for those things. But then again, sometimes there's conditions with it that they don't like, okay? Now, why did the Kansas-Nebraska Act kill the Whig Party? And I think maybe the death of the Whig Party started with the Compromise of 1850, and some of this goes to Daniel Webster. Some historians state that Daniel Webster, who's one of the greatest speakers in congressional history, United States history, destroyed his political career when he came out in favor of the Compromise of 1850 because of its embrace of the fugitive slave law. The Whigs tend to be anti-expansion because there are also many in the Whig Party, although they're kind of neutral on slavery, many in the Whig Party are against its expansion, okay? But they ended up supporting the fugitive slave law. That caused a lot of people to leave their party. what happens is you have this party called the Free Soilers, which I think I mentioned one other time, and they're going to pull votes away from the Whig Party in the 1852 presidential election, once again due to their support of the Fugitive Slave Law. The Whig candidate in 1852 is Winfield Scott, and he's going to lose in a landslide to Franklin Pierce. And so what we see is the Whigs are like, okay, we got to do something about this. Abraham Lincoln, who was a prominent Whig leader at the time, prominent Whig candidate, just active in the Whig Party, he's going to realize this. And what's going to happen is you're going to see the formation of the Republican Party. Okay. And this gave birth to the Republican Party, whose primary purpose was to prevent the expansion of slavery. Now, the Republican Party is a hodgepodge of different views on the expansion of slavery. It's going to be made up of abolitionists who want to end slavery now. It's going to be made up of free soilers who just don't want slavery to spread and think it'll eventually die out. That's probably where you would frame Lincoln in this time period. And it's going to be made up of colonizationists who think that, African Americans shouldn't even be in the United States, right? And segregationists. So it's just, what is the one thing that unites them? They're all against the expansion of slavery. They're all against the slave power being the controlling interest and guider of American policy. Okay, that's their primary issue that the Republican Party forms on. Okay, all right, so closing comments here. You may remember I asked you a key question. And the key question is, what irreconcilable differences will eventually lead to civil war? Since it's Zoom, usually if you're in class, I might ask you guys this, but since it's Zoom, I'm going to suggest them. Expansion of slavery, of course, the new fugitive slave law, right, and resistance to its enforcement. The two labor systems, right? What is going to be the main labor system of the United States going forward, coming out of the Civil War? Industrial wage labor or agrarian slave labor, right? That's a key issue going into the Civil War. And then popular sovereignty versus federal determination of slavery's expansion. Okay, who should decide, or what power should decide whether or not slavery should expand? Should it be based on popular sovereignty, or should it be based on federal law? What does the Constitution say on this issue? Will be debated. And then this kind of leads to the notion that we see going forward, coming out of the Civil War with Reconstruction, of who is in charge of protecting citizenship rights. Is that a state issue, or is that a federal issue? Because what we're going to see coming out of Reconstruction is what happens when it's the state and local governments that are denying citizenship rights, right? And then we're going to see people argue that that's when the federal government should step in, and then you see the passage of amendments like the 14th in particular. Okay, and then those will kind of frame the nation's debates going forward. Okay. Any questions of me? Okay. I'm gonna let you guys go. If you have questions, please let me know. You don't have to respond to this lecture just yet. Work on your fugitive slave law assignment tonight, Anthony Burns, right? Thursday, I'll post this with the lecture I gave you on Thursday, which will be getting more into, well, Lincoln Douglas debates and the arguments that are continuing to divide the country as we get into Civil War. John Brown, Josh is probably going to come up in that lecture, so feel free to correct me on any mistakes I make, okay? All right? Okay, guys, I appreciate your attention. Have a good day. I'll see you tomorrow.